They called it the Cauldron of Death. As dawn broke on July the 5th, 1943, German tank commander Otto Carius peered through his periscope at the rolling hills outside Kursk. The morning mist still clung to the ground as he scanned the terrain ahead. His Panzer VI Tiger, a 60-ton steel behemoth, had been positioned at the spearhead of the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion. In the dim light, he could just make out the silhouettes of dozens of other German tanks forming up in attack positions. What he couldn't see, hidden in the landscape beyond, were over 3,000 Soviet tanks, including hundreds of the dreaded T-34s, waiting in defensive positions stretching back nearly 200 miles. The German crews were about to face the largest tank battle in human history, and many would never return. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The morning stillness was suddenly shattered as thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, their shells arcing overhead with a sound like tearing fabric. Operation Citadel had begun. Inside his Tiger tank, Carius felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness that came before combat. The radio crackled with orders, and he instructed his driver to advance. The massive engine roared to life, and the tank lurched forward, tracks digging into the soft earth. What the German tankers couldn't know was that Soviet intelligence had provided Stalin with detailed plans of the German attack weeks in advance. The Red Army had transformed the Kursk salient into perhaps the most heavily defended piece of real estate in military history. Layer upon layer of minefields, anti-tank guns, artillery positions, and tank brigades were waiting in carefully prepared positions. The Germans were advancing into a meticulously crafted kill zone. In the months leading up to this massive confrontation, both sides had been locked in a technological arms race. The Germans had accelerated production of their new Panther and Tiger tanks, designed specifically to counter the Soviet T-34. These German tanks featured thicker armor and more powerful guns than anything seen before on the Eastern Front. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate a T-34's armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, while the T-34's 76mm gun struggled to penetrate Tiger armor even at close range. But the Soviets had numbers on their side, overwhelming numbers. For every Tiger or Panther, they could field 10 or more T-34s. Soviet factories, relocated beyond the Ural Mountains and safe from German bombing, were producing tanks at a staggering rate, sometimes over 1,000 per month. The T-34 was simpler, more reliable, and far easier to produce than its German counterparts. It was designed for mass production, with wide tracks that performed exceptionally well in the muddy Russian terrain. The German tank crews knew the statistics all too well. In theory, a single Tiger could destroy multiple T-34s before they could get close enough to be effective. But theory and battlefield reality were very different matters. The complex German machines were prone to mechanical failures, consumed enormous amounts of fuel, and were difficult to recover when damaged. A Tiger tank weighed 56 tons and would often sink into soft ground, becoming immobilized. The lighter T-34, weighing 26 tons, was far more maneuverable. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the temperature inside the German tanks climbed rapidly. The steel boxes became ovens in the summer heat, sometimes exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees. Crews stripped down to their undershirts, sweat soaking through the fabric as they performed their duties. The commander scanned for targets. The gunner waited tensely for fire commands. The loaders stood ready with heavy, armor-piercing shells. The radio operator monitored communications, and the driver navigated the treacherous terrain. Günter Klink, a 20-year-old gunner in a Panzer IV, would later recall, "We had been told the Russians were on the run, that one final push would break their resistance." What we found at Kursk was something else entirely. They were waiting for us, and they had prepared hell itself. The first wave of German tanks crossed their own artillery barrage and entered the initial Soviet defensive belt. Almost immediately, tanks began hitting mines. The explosions tore tracks from drive wheels, immobilizing vehicles and forcing crews to continue the advance with reduced numbers. Soviet observation posts reported the German movements, and artillery fire began landing among the advancing panzers. For the German tankers, the battle immediately devolved into a nightmarish gauntlet. Soviet defensive positions were arrayed in depth, with multiple belts of obstacles and pre-sighted artillery zones. Anti-tank guns were concealed in prepared positions, revealing themselves only when German tanks came within lethal range. The Soviet Air Force made periodic attacks, and landmines were everywhere. Inside his tank, Kursk heard a tremendous explosion just 50 meters ahead. A Panzer IV had struck a mine, its turret thrown violently upward before crashing back onto its hull, flames already consuming the vehicle. There was no sign of survivors. He ordered his driver to adjust course, veering around the burning wreck. "Target, 2 o'clock, anti-tank gun," his gunner shouted. "Fire when ready," Kursk commanded. The 80mm gun roared, the tank rocking backward with the recoil. Through his periscope, Kursk saw the Soviet position disintegrate under the direct hit. But for every Soviet position destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear. The battlefield was becoming littered with knocked-out tanks from both sides. Black smoke columns rose across the horizon, marking funeral pyres for tank crews who had been too slow, too unlucky, or simply overwhelmed by superior numbers. By mid-morning, the German advance had slowed significantly. The initial push had gained perhaps 3 to 5 kilometers, far short of expectations. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the German Ninth Army in the northern sector of the battle, received increasingly desperate reports from his panzer divisions. They were taking heavy losses and making minimal progress against the Soviet defenses. The German commanders had anticipated breaking through the Soviet defenses within the first day. Their plan relied on speed and shock, a rapid penetration that would allow them to encircle Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. But the Soviets had transformed the battlefield into a meat grinder, trading space for time, bleeding the German panzer divisions with each kilometer of advance. For the tank crews, the morning's optimism had given way to grim determination. Every movement forward was contested. Soviet T-34s, initially hiding in prepared positions, began counterattacks against the German flanks. Though individually outgunned by Tigers and Panthers, the T-34s operated in groups of 5 or more, attempting to outflank and attack the German tanks from the sides or rear, where armor was thinner. Kurt Meyer, a Panzer III commander with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, described the Soviet tactics. They would hold back until we were engaged with their anti-tank screen, then suddenly T-34s would appear from nowhere, racing toward our flanks at high speed. We had to constantly swivel our turrets between multiple threats. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work. The German tank crews fought with the desperate efficiency of men whose lives depended on split-second decisions. Inside each tank, the 5-man crew operated as a single organism. The commander spotted targets and gave fire orders. The gunner made minute adjustments to the gun elevation and traverse. The loader, muscles straining, slammed 15-kilogram armor-piercing rounds into the breach. The driver navigated through a battlefield becoming increasingly cluttered with burning vehicles and crater-pocked ground. The radio operator maintained contact with other tanks and headquarters, all while manning the hull machine gun. By noon, temperatures had reached punishing levels. Inside the tanks, conditions were almost unbearable. Ventilation was minimal, and the combined heat from the engine, firing mechanism, and summer sun created an inferno. Men drank water constantly, but still became dehydrated. Some tankers opened hatches for air, despite the danger from snipers and shrapnel. Werner Gössel, a Tiger commander with the Grossdeutschland Division, recalled the conditions. We were soaked with sweat, our eardrums pounding from the constant noise of the engine and gun. The smell was a mixture of cordite, oil, exhaust fumes, and unwashed bodies. Your eyes stung from the sweat and gun fumes. But you couldn't show weakness. Your crew's lives depended on your commands. The battle's intensity only increased as the day progressed. Soviet artillery had pre-registered the terrain, allowing them to deliver devastating fire on German concentrations. Red Army Air Force planes made occasional appearances, strafing German columns. But the most dreaded sound for German tankers was the distinctive high-pitched whine of the Stalin organ, the Katyusha multiple rocket launcher that could saturate an area with explosive firepower in seconds. When you heard that sound, recalled Otto Carius years later, all you could do was button up the tank and pray. The rockets couldn't penetrate our armor directly, but they could throw tracks, damage external equipment, or worse, find an open hatch. By mid-afternoon, the German advance had stalled across most of the front. The Ninth Army in the north had penetrated only about 10 kilometers into Soviet defenses, far short of the anticipated breakthrough. In the southern sector, the 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth had made somewhat better progress but was still bogged down in successive defensive belts. For the tank crews, the technical advantages of German armor were being nullified by the conditions. Tigers and Panthers, with their powerful engines, consumed fuel at alarming rates. Their complex drivetrains and suspensions suffered in the rough terrain. Tanks that broke down often had to be abandoned, as recovery under fire was frequently impossible. The T-34, by contrast, was built for these conditions. Its wide tracks provided excellent ground pressure distribution, reducing the chance of becoming stuck. Its Christie suspension system offered superior cross-country performance, and its diesel engine was less likely to catch fire when hit than the gasoline engines of many German tanks. As the first day of battle wore on, German tank commanders faced difficult decisions. Fuel was running low, ammunition stocks were depleting, and casualties mounted. Many tanks had suffered mobility hits, damaged tracks, or suspension components that left them unable to maneuver effectively. Crew fatigue became an increasing factor as the constant tension, heat, and physical exertion took their toll. The human cost was mounting hourly. When a tank was hit, the results were often catastrophic. A penetrating hit could ignite ammunition or fuel, causing the tank to brew up, military slang for a vehicle consumed by fire. Crews had seconds to escape through hatches before their tank became a crematorium. Many never made it out. Those who did escape burning tanks faced new dangers on the open battlefield. Soviet infantry targeted damaged German tanks, knowing crew members might be trapped inside or attempting to flee. Many German tankers carried pistols or submachine guns for self-defense, if forced to abandon their vehicles. Franz Becke, a dentist before the war, who became one of Germany's most decorated tank commanders, lost 3 tanks in a single day at Kursk. After escaping his third burning tank, he gathered survivors from other knocked-out vehicles and formed them into an impromptu infantry unit to fight their way back to German lines. The worst thing, Becke later wrote, was seeing your comrades' tanks hit and being unable to help. You would hear their screams over the radio as they burned. Then silence. You had to keep fighting, but a part of you died each time. By evening of that first day, the Germans had suffered staggering losses. The Ninth Army alone had lost over 200 tanks and assault guns, around 25% of their armored strength. Casualties among tank crews were even higher proportionally, as many tanks lost multiple crews through the course of successive engagements. As darkness fell, German tank units consolidated their positions and established defensive perimeters. Maintenance crews worked through the night, attempting to repair damaged vehicles and return them to combat readiness. Fuel tankers moved forward to resupply the thirsty Panthers and Tigers. Ammunition was redistributed, with priority given to frontline units expected to lead the next day's assault. For the exhausted tank crews, there was little rest. guards had to be posted as Soviet infiltration units were active at night. Damaged tanks had to be recovered where possible. The wounded needed evacuation, and commanders gathered to assess the day's losses and plan the next day's operations. Field reports sent back to Army Group Center painted a troubling picture. The 9th Army's War Diary noted, strong enemy resistance and deeply echeloned defenses have prevented the achievement of daily objectives. Losses in men and material have been severe. Anticipated breakthrough has not materialized. Unknown to the German commanders, the Soviet defensive strategy was working exactly as Marshal Georgy Zhukov had planned. The Red Army had absorbed the initial German assault, trading space for time and wearing down the elite panzer divisions. Soviet reserves were still intact, while German units had already committed their best troops and equipment. As July 6th dawned, German tank crews prepared for another day of battle. Equipment was checked, ammunition restocked, and hasty repairs completed where possible. Commanders received updated orders. The assault would continue with adjusted axes of advance based on the previous day's experience. The mood among the German tankers had changed. The confident expectation of a swift breakthrough had been replaced by grim determination. They had encountered a defense in depth unlike anything previously seen on the Eastern Front, and the Soviet willingness to absorb punishment and counterattack was undiminished. Hermann von Oppeln-Bronichowski, commanding a panzer regiment in the Grossdeutschland Division, addressed his officers before the second day's attack. "Gentlemen, yesterday we encountered prepared defenses of unprecedented strength. Today will be no easier, but we have identified weaknesses in the enemy lines. We will concentrate our force at these points. The Russian is tough, but not invincible." As the German tanks advanced again into the Soviet defensive belts, a new factor entered the battle. The reserves of the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army began moving into position. This fresh formation, equipped primarily with T-34s, represented the Soviet concept of a mobile striking force, held back until the moment was right to deliver a decisive counterattack. The German tank crews, already battling Soviet defensive positions, now faced the prospect of a major armored counterattack against their extended positions. The stage was set for the largest tank engagement of the battle, and perhaps of the entire war, at a collective farm near the village of Prokharovka. For the German tank crews, exhausted by days of constant fighting in punishing conditions, the battle was about to reach its climactic phase. The confidence that had marked the launch of Operation Citadel had evaporated, replaced by a growing realization that they were engaged in a battle of attrition they could not win. The Soviet strategy was becoming clear. They had allowed the Germans to impale themselves on successive defensive belts, bleeding their strength, and now prepared to deliver a counterstroke with fresh forces. The German tank crews, their numbers already reduced by combat and mechanical losses, would face the full weight of Soviet reserves. As German tanks pushed forward on July 7th, they encountered increasingly determined resistance. Soviet defensive positions were now more densely packed, with anti-tank guns sighted to create interlocking fields of fire. Every advance was contested, every kilometer gained paid for in German blood and burning tanks. The physical and psychological strain on the tank crews was reaching a breaking point. Many had been fighting continuously for 3 days, snatching only brief periods of rest. Inside the tanks, conditions remained brutal. The combination of summer heat, engine heat, and exertion created an environment where heat exhaustion was a constant danger. Erich von Manstein, the field marshal commanding Army Group South, was growing increasingly concerned about the slow progress and mounting losses. His 4th Panzer Army had penetrated deeper into Soviet defenses than Model's 9th Army in the north, but was still far from achieving the envisioned breakthrough that would allow the encirclement of Soviet forces. The German tank crews knew nothing of the strategic picture. Their world had contracted to the immediate battlefield around them. Each day brought the same routine: advance, engage Soviet defensive positions, destroy what they could, and try to survive. The focus narrowed to the next ridgeline, the next village, the next enemy tank. Hauptmann Michael Wittmann, a Tiger commander who would later become one of Germany's most famous tank aces, described the mental state. After days of constant combat, you enter a strange state of mind. Fear is still present, but it becomes distant, almost academic. Your world shrinks to your tank, your crew, your immediate objectives. The larger war fades away. You exist in a bubble of extreme alertness, focused on survival. On July 9th, forward elements of the Deccan SS Panzer Corps approached the area around Prokharovka. Intelligence reports indicated significant Soviet armor concentrations moving into the area. The flat open terrain south of the town was ideal for a large-scale tank engagement, a fact not lost on Soviet planners. The night before the engagement, German tank crews performed maintenance with a special urgency. They knew something big was coming. Ammunition was carefully stacked in accessible positions inside the cramped turrets. Engines were checked and rechecked. Fuel tanks were topped off. Some crews even added extra track links to their turret fronts as improvised additional armor. In the pre-dawn hours of July 12th, German and Soviet tank forces moved into their start positions around Prokharovka. The flat terrain was occasionally broken by gullies, small woods, and low ridgelines, enough to provide some concealment for tanks, but not enough to prevent what was about to become a swirling melee of armored vehicles. As the morning mist began to lift, the German tankers could see dust clouds on the horizon, the unmistakable signature of large Soviet armored formations in movement. The 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, was committing over 800 tanks and self-propelled guns to a massive counterattack against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Radio traffic increased as German commanders issued last-minute orders. Inside the tanks, crews performed final checks of their weapons. Gunners adjusted their sights. Loaders positioned shells for quick access, and drivers tested their controls. The tense silence inside each tank was broken only by terse commands and acknowledgments. At approximately 0830 hours, the horizon erupted with fire as hundreds of Soviet artillery pieces opened up on German positions. The barrage lasted about 30 minutes, shells crashing among the German tanks and infantry positions, throwing up fountains of earth and shrapnel. Then, through the dust and smoke, came the Soviet tanks. Wave after wave of T-34s advanced across the open ground, hundreds of vehicles moving forward simultaneously. The sound was like continuous thunder as their diesel engines roared at full power. German tank commanders watched in a mixture of awe and dread as the Soviet armor approached. The T-34s were advancing at high speed, some moving at over 25 miles per hour across the flat terrain. Soviet commanders had ordered their tankers to close distance quickly, negating the Germans' advantage in long-range gunnery. "They came at us like a wall of steel," remembered Johann Voss, a Tiger gunner. "I had never seen so many tanks in one place. Through my gun sight, I could see T-34 after T-34 emerging from the dust and smoke. Our commander was shouting target instructions faster than I could acquire them." The battle devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee at close quarters, exactly the type of engagement Soviet commanders had sought. The superior range and penetration of German tank guns became less relevant as the fighting distance closed to 500 meters or less. At such ranges, T-34s could effectively engage even Tigers and Panthers, especially from the flanks. The flat terrain offered little cover, forcing tank crews to rely on maneuver and firepower for survival. Tanks from both sides raced across the battlefield, firing on the move, attempting to gain advantageous firing positions. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the smell of burning diesel and gasoline as more and more vehicles were hit. For the German tankers, the situation quickly became desperate. Their carefully rehearsed tactics, based on engaging from defensive positions at long range, were impossible in the chaotic conditions. Soviet T-34s were swarming around the heavier German tanks, firing from multiple directions, forcing German commanders to constantly rotate their turrets to face new threats. Rudolf von Ribbentrop, son of the German foreign minister and a tank commander in the 1st SS Panzer Division, later described the scene. It was tank against tank, a pure slugging match. The Russians were coming from everywhere. You would destroy one T-34, and 3 more would appear from the dust. We were firing at targets as close as 50 meters. I could see the faces of the Russian tank commanders in my binoculars. Inside the German tanks, crews worked with frantic efficiency. Commanders shouted target instructions, gunners traversed turrets and adjusted elevation with practiced movements, and loaders heaved shell after shell into the breach, their arms burning with the effort. The rate of fire was limited primarily by how quickly the loader could ready the next round. Under ideal conditions, a Tiger crew might manage 1 shot every 6 to 8 seconds. But in the heat of battle, with the tank moving and taking hits, the pace was often slower. The noise inside was deafening, a cacophony of engine roar, cannon fire, and the metallic clang of hits on the armor. Communication was by shouting or through the intercom system, which was often drowned out by the ambient noise. Hand signals became essential when verbal commands couldn't be heard. As the battle raged, the German tanks' technical advantages were partly neutralized by the conditions. Their superior optical sights and fire control systems, which allowed accurate first-round hits at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, were less decisive in the close-quarters combat. The Soviet tactic of hugging German tanks, staying so close that the German turret couldn't depress enough to target them, proved effective in many instances. The T-34s had another advantage that became apparent as the battle progressed. Their diesel engines were less likely to catch fire when hit than the gasoline engines in many German tanks. A penetrating hit on a German tank often resulted in a catastrophic fire, while T-34s sometimes survived multiple hits without burning. By midday, the battlefield around Prokharovka had become a hellscape of burning tanks and dead or wounded crewmen. Visibility was reduced to a few hundred meters by the pall of smoke and dust hanging over the area. German and Soviet tanks maneuvered through this artificial twilight, sometimes encountering enemy vehicles at point-blank range. SS Unterscharführer Franz Staudiger, a Tiger commander with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, found himself suddenly face-to-face with 3 T-34s at a distance of less than 100 meters. His gunner destroyed the first with a shot through the front hull, but the other 2 circled to attack his flanks. Staudiger ordered his driver to reverse while pivoting the turret, managing to hit the 2nd T-34 in the turret ring, disabling it. The 3rd got off a shot that struck the Tiger's side armor but failed to penetrate, before Staudiger's gunner destroyed it with a round through its thinner side armor. Such encounters were happening all across the battlefield as hundreds of tanks engaged in what amounted to armored close-quarters combat. The fighting was taking place at such intimate ranges that German and Soviet tank commanders could sometimes see each other's faces as they maneuvered for killing shots. Ammunition consumption reached unprecedented levels. A Tiger tank carried about 92 rounds for its 80mm main gun, while a T-34 typically carried about 77 rounds for its 76mm gun. In the intensity of the Prokharovka engagement, many tanks exhausted half their ammunition load within the first hour of combat. By early afternoon, losses on both sides had reached staggering levels. The Thai SS Panzer Corps had lost dozens of irreplaceable Tigers and Panthers, along with many Panzerhilfes. The 5th Guards Tank Army had lost perhaps 400 tanks and self-propelled guns, a devastating toll, but one the Soviets could ultimately replace. More significantly, the Soviet counterattack had achieved its strategic purpose. The momentum of the German advance had been blunted, and the prospect of a breakthrough leading to the encirclement of Soviet forces in the Kursk salient had evaporated. For the German tank crews, the battle's tempo began to slacken as the afternoon progressed. Ammunition was running low, fuel tanks were approaching empty, and many vehicles had sustained damage that impaired their combat effectiveness. Fatigue was becoming a critical factor as crews entered their 4th or 5th hour of continuous high-intensity combat. As the sun began to descend on July 12th, both sides disengaged to regroup, recover damaged vehicles, and evacuate casualties. The fields around Prokharovka were littered with hundreds of burnt-out tanks. The air stank of diesel fuel, cordite, and the unmistakable sweet, sickly odor of burnt flesh. The German tank crews, extracting themselves from the battlefield, were in a state of physical and emotional exhaustion. Many had lost friends and comrades. All had endured hours of extreme stress, physical exertion, and the constant fear of a violent death inside a burning tank. Technical reports compiled that evening painted a grim picture for German commanders. The elite panzer divisions had suffered losses they could not afford. Fuel reserves were critically low, with some units reporting less than 20% of authorized levels remaining. Ammunition stocks, especially for the specialized armor-piercing rounds needed by Tigers and Panthers, were severely depleted. More concerning were the personnel losses. Tank crews, especially experienced commanders, gunners, and driver mechanics, represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. A new tank could be produced in weeks, but forming an effective crew took months or years. The following day, July 13th, Hitler summoned his senior commanders to a conference at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Reports from the front had made it clear that Operation Citadel had failed to achieve its objectives and was now consuming irreplaceable German resources at an unsustainable rate. Meanwhile, Anglo-American forces had landed in Sicily on July 10th, opening a new front that would require German reinforcements. After tense discussions, Hitler made the decision to terminate Operation Citadel. The offensive would be wound down, and key panzer divisions would be withdrawn for redeployment to the Mediterranean theater. For the German tank crews still engaged around Kursk, the strategic implications of Hitler's decision were unknown. Their world remained confined to the immediate tactical situation, engaging Soviet forces, protecting their damaged vehicles, and trying to survive. The battle had forever changed the lives of those who participated. Many German tankers who survived Kursk would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Burns were among the most common injuries for tank crew members, often leaving disfiguring scars. Others suffered hearing damage from the constant noise or respiratory problems from prolonged exposure to engine fumes and cordite in the confined space of a tank. Less visible but equally profound were the psychological impacts. Combat stress, what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected many veterans of tank warfare. The constant tension, the claustrophobic conditions, and the ever-present fear of a burning death inside a metal coffin created lasting psychological effects. Karl Broman, a Panzer IV commander who fought at Kursk, later described recurring nightmares. For years after, I would wake up screaming, believing I was trapped in a burning tank. The dreams were so vivid I could feel the heat, smell the fuel fire, hear the ammunition cooking off. My wife had to shake me awake from these episodes. As the German forces began a strategic withdrawal from the Kursk salient, the full implications of the battle became apparent. Operation Citadel had represented Germany's last opportunity to seize the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Its failure marked a decisive turning point in the war. The Soviet victory at Kursk was followed by a series of major counteroffensives that would continue with occasional pauses until the Red Army reached Berlin in 1945. For the German tank crews, Kursk marked the beginning of a long, grueling defensive campaign characterized by constant retreats, fuel shortages, and increasingly desperate attempts to stem the Soviet advance. In the aftermath of the battle, both sides assessed what they had learned. For the Soviets, Kursk validated their defensive doctrine of deeply echeloned defenses and their offensive tactic of overwhelming German positions with mass attacks by T-34s. Soviet tank production continued to accelerate with emphasis on quantity and reliability over technological sophistication. The Germans, confronting the reality that they could not match Soviet production, doubled down on technological superiority. The later variants of the Tiger and Panther incorporated lessons from Kursk, with improved reliability, better ammunition stowage to reduce fire risks, and enhanced armor protection. But for the tank crews who had fought at Kursk, perhaps the most significant lesson was a brutal truth about modern mechanized warfare. Technology alone was not decisive. The battle had demonstrated that courage, skill, and superior equipment could be overwhelmed by an enemy willing to accept enormous losses to achieve strategic objectives. Otto Carius, who survived Kursk and went on to become one of Germany's highest-scoring tank aces, reflected years later on what he had learned. At Kursk, we discovered that you could do everything right, use perfect tactics, score multiple kills, fight with utmost courage, and still lose the battle. War is not fair. It does not reward virtue or punish vice. It simply grinds men and machines, caring nothing for either. The experience of German tank crews at Kursk reveals much about the nature of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Inside their steel boxes, men from different backgrounds, farmers, factory workers, students, professionals, were transformed into components of a war machine operating at the limits of human endurance. The physical conditions were extreme. Summer temperatures inside a tank could exceed 50 degrees. In winter, crews often worked in sub-zero temperatures, their hands sticking to metal surfaces. The confined space, a Tiger tank's fighting compartment, was about 23 cubic meters, shared by 5 men plus ammunition, equipment, and personal gear, created a claustrophobic environment where privacy was non-existent. Hygiene was a constant challenge. During extended operations, crews might go days without proper washing facilities. The smell inside a tank after several days of continuous operation, a mixture of sweat, engine oil, cordite residue, urine bottles, used when it was too dangerous to exit the tank, and food remains, was overpowering. Food was typically cold rations eaten whenever there was a lull in fighting. Hot meals were a luxury, usually only available when in reserve positions. Water was often in short supply, especially during summer operations, leading to dehydration and heat stress. Sleep deprivation was another enemy. During active operations, crew members might manage only brief naps, leading to a state of chronic exhaustion that impaired judgment and reflexes. Some tankers reported hallucinations after multiple days of limited sleep during intense combat operations. Noise was a constant companion. The engine of a Tiger tank generated around 90 decibels inside the fighting compartment, roughly equivalent to standing next to a lawnmower, and this was the ambient background noise. Firing the main gun or taking hits on the armor created sound spikes that could cause permanent hearing damage. Many veteran tankers suffered partial hearing loss. Despite these conditions, tank crews often developed intense bonds. The confined space and shared danger created relationships of extraordinary closeness. Each crew member's life depended directly on the competence and courage of his comrades. This interdependence fostered a brotherhood that many veterans described as unlike any other relationship in their lives. Franz Gorowski, who served as a radio operator in a Panzer IV, later wrote, "We were closer than family. We knew each other's thoughts without words." In civilian life, you might work with someone for years and not know them as well as we knew each other after a few months in a tank. When you've trusted someone with your life day after day, other relationships seem shallow by comparison. The nature of armored warfare created a unique psychological environment. Unlike infantry combat, where a soldier might see his enemy face to face, tank warfare was often more abstract. Targets were acquired through optical sights appearing as distant shapes rather than visible human beings. This created a certain emotional distance from the act of killing. Yet this abstraction was counterbalanced by the intense vulnerability tankers felt. They were acutely aware that their survival depended on a few inches of steel plate. A single well-placed enemy shot could transform their vehicle into an inferno within seconds. This combination of lethal power and extreme vulnerability created a distinctive psychological profile among tank crews. Horst Zobel, a Panther commander who fought from Kursk to the end of the war, described this duality. Inside your tank, you feel powerful. You can destroy buildings, other vehicles, enemy positions, but simultaneously you feel terribly vulnerable. You know exactly where your armor is thinnest, which angles are most dangerous. Every moment you're calculating risks, trying to minimize your exposure while maximizing your effectiveness. The technological race between German and Soviet tank design accelerated after Kursk. The Soviets introduced the improved T-34-85 with a larger 85mm gun capable of threatening German heavy tanks at greater ranges. They also fielded heavy tanks like the IS-2, Joseph Stalin, armed with a 122mm gun specifically designed to counter German Tigers and Panthers. The Germans responded with even heavier designs, culminating in the 70-ton King Tiger, Tiger II, with armor up to 180mm thick, and the massive Jag Tiger tank destroyer with a 128mm gun. These vehicles were technically impressive, but strategically irrelevant. Too few, too late, too fuel-hungry, and too maintenance-intensive to alter the war's outcome. For German tank crews, the period after Kursk was one of constant retreat and increasingly desperate battles. Fuel shortages became chronic, forcing tanks to be used as static pillboxes rather than mobile weapons. Spare parts grew scarcer, resulting in cannibalization, the practice of stripping damaged tanks to keep others running. The human cost continued to mount. New replacement crew members arrived with increasingly limited training, often barely familiar with their vehicles before being thrown into combat. Veterans took on the additional burden of trying to keep these newcomers alive long enough to gain experience, while simultaneously fighting a war they were now losing. As the Soviet offensives gained momentum following Kursk, German tank crews found themselves increasingly outnumbered. The ratio of Soviet to German tanks, which had been roughly 3.1 at Kursk, expanded to 5:1 or even 7:1 in later battles. The superior quality of German tanks could no longer compensate for the overwhelming Soviet numerical advantage. Erich Hoppe, who commanded a Panther in the retreat from Ukraine in 1944, described the psychological impact. Before Kursk, we believed victory was possible if we fought hard enough, if our tanks were good enough. After Kursk, deep down, we knew we were fighting a losing battle. But what choice did we have? You fight for your comrades beside you, for your family at home, even when strategic victory seems impossible. The Soviet T-34 had proven itself at Kursk not because it was technically superior to German tanks, it wasn't, but because it represented a different philosophy of tank design and employment. The T-34 embodied the Soviet approach to industrialized warfare, mass production of equipment that was good enough rather than perfect, emphasis on reliability and ease of maintenance over technological sophistication, and willingness to accept losses as part of operational doctrine. By contrast, German tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, represented a different approach. Technological excellence at the expense of production efficiency, complex designs that maximized combat performance but compromised reliability, and tactics that relied on qualitative superiority to offset quantitative disadvantage. The clash between these philosophies reached its climax at Kursk, and the Soviet approach prevailed. It wasn't that the T-34 was a better tank in absolute terms. A Tiger could destroy multiple T-34s in a direct engagement, but that the T-34 was better suited to the strategic realities of the Eastern Front. For the German tank crews who survived Kursk, this reality became increasingly apparent as the war continued. They found themselves fighting defensive battles against ever-increasing numbers of Soviet tanks, knowing that each German tank lost represented that irreplaceable asset, while Soviet losses could be quickly replaced. Karl-Heinz Wurthmann, who commanded a Panzer IV at Kursk and survived to fight in the defense of Germany in 1945, reflected on this asymmetry. In 1943, if we lost a tank, we might get a replacement in a week. By 1944, it might take a month, if it came at all. But the Russians, they seemed to have endless reserves of T-34s. We'd destroyed dozens in an engagement, and the next day they'd be back with more. It was like fighting the tide. The technological lessons of Kursk influenced tank design for decades after the war. The balance between firepower, protection, and mobility, the three fundamental elements of tank design, was forever altered by the experience of the largest tank battle in history. The Soviet approach, emphasizing mobility and numerical superiority, would inform their Cold War tank designs like the T-34, 55, and T-62. The Western approach, drawing more from German concepts of technological quality, would lead to tanks like the American M1 Abrams and the German Leopard 2, vehicles that prioritized crew survival and technical sophistication. But for the men who fought at Kursk, these future developments were irrelevant. Their world had been reduced to the immediate reality of survival inside steel boxes under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Each day brought new challenges, new losses, new demonstrations of courage and fear, endurance and exhaustion. The story of German tank crews at Kursk is ultimately a human story of men pushed to the limits of endurance, fighting a battle they ultimately could not win, yet displaying extraordinary courage and skill in the process. It is a story of technological hubris meeting strategic reality, of tactical excellence overwhelmed by operational depth, of individual heroism rendered futile by the impersonal mathematics of industrial war. In the decades after the war, survivors from both sides occasionally met at reunions and commemorations. Former enemies found they shared a bond that civilians could never fully understand, the experience of having fought inside tanks in the largest armored clash in military history. At one such reunion in 1998, Alexander Fadeev, who had commanded a T-34 at Prokharovka, embraced Otto Karius, the German Tiger commander. "We tried to kill each other then," Fadeev said, "but we were both just young men following orders, doing what we thought was right for our countries." Karius nodded. "The tanks were just machines," he replied. "The real story was always about the men inside them." That sentiment perhaps best captures the essence of the Battle of Kursk. Beyond the statistics, the strategies, the technical specifications of the tanks involved, it was fundamentally about human beings engaged in combat under conditions of extreme stress, displaying both the worst and the best aspects of humanity in the process. The battlefield at Kursk has long since been reclaimed by nature and agriculture. The shell craters have been filled in, the burnt-out tanks removed for scrap, the land returned to productive use. Little remains to mark the site of history's greatest tank battle except monuments and museums maintained by the Russian government. But the legacy of Kursk lives on in military doctrine, tank design, and the memories of the ever-dwindling number of veterans who experienced it firsthand. It stands as a testament to human endurance, a cautionary tale about technological overconfidence, and a sobering reminder of the human cost of industrialized warfare. For the German tank crews who fought there, Kursk represented both the zenith and the beginning of the end. Never again would German armored forces mount a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From July 1943 onward, they would be engaged in a fighting retreat that would end only in Berlin 2 years later. The survivors carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many found it difficult to explain to family and friends what they had endured. How could someone who hadn't been there understand what it was like to be inside a burning tank, or to watch comrades die in a metal coffin, or to fight for days on end in conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress? Some found solace in the camaraderie of veterans' organizations, where they could talk with others who shared their experiences. Others preferred to put the past behind them, rarely speaking of what they had seen and done during the war. Almost all had to find ways to reconcile their wartime experiences with civilian life in post-war Germany. Wilhelm Knispel, who fought at Kursk as a gunner in a Tiger and went on to become Germany's highest-scoring tank ace of the war, rarely spoke about his experiences after 1945. When pressed by historians, he would say only, "I did my duty as I understood it. The rest is for others to judge." For many veterans, the technical aspects of tank warfare, the specifications of different vehicles, the tactics, the maintenance procedures, became a safe way to discuss their wartime experiences without confronting the more difficult emotional and moral questions. Tank enthusiasts and military historians found them eager to discuss the relative merits of the Tiger versus the T-34, but reluctant to talk about the human cost of the battles in which these machines were employed. This technological focus has sometimes obscured the human dimension of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. The tanks themselves have become iconic, museum pieces, subjects of detailed models, stars of computer games and films. But the men who fought inside them, who lived and died in these steel boxes, are often reduced to statistics or anecdotes. The reality of their experience was far more complex and nuanced than most popular accounts suggest. They were not simply extensions of their machines, nor were they the superhuman warriors of propaganda. They were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, trying to survive while doing what they believed was their duty. Their story is ultimately about human beings under extreme stress, their courage and their fear, their triumphs and their failures, their capacity for both remarkable endurance and profound despair. It is a story that transcends the specific historical context of the Eastern Front in World War II to touch on universal aspects of the human experience of war. As the last veterans of Kursk pass away, their first-hand accounts are being lost. What remains are the memoirs, the interviews, the letters, and the official records, important sources, but inevitably filtered through the distortions of memory and the constraints of documentation. The full human reality of what it was like to be inside a German tank at Kursk in July 1943 is fading into history. Yet the essential lessons of their experience remain relevant in an age of increasingly technological warfare. No matter how sophisticated the equipment, war is ultimately fought by human beings with human limitations. No technological advantage, no matter how significant, can fully compensate for a strategic overreach or numerical inferiority. And the human cost of war, though often obscured by focus on equipment and tactics, remains its most important and enduring legacy. The German tank crews at Kursk, whether they realized it or not, were participating in a pivotal moment in military history, the point at which the tactical advantages of German armor were finally and decisively outweighed by the strategic advantages of Soviet mass production and operational depth. Their experience stands as both a testament to the limits of technological superiority and a reminder of the human dimension of even the most mechanized forms of warfare. In the end, the story of German tank crews at Kursk is not just about the clash of steel monsters on the Russian steppe. It is about human beings inside those machines, their fears and hopes, their suffering and endurance, their victories and defeats. It is a story that reminds us that even in the most mechanized form of combat, war remains a profoundly human experience, with all the complexity and contradiction that implies.